So, Richard and Harrison, talk a little bit about the challenges of shooting all this, because it's almost as if there were two films. There was this live-action film that had to be shot, you know, conventionally, even though it was unconventional, but with a film and a camera, and then there was the animated process afterwards.
The challenge was to try to pay attention to the details but keep the overall picture. Excuse the pun, but when a director, and who also happens to be the writer, makes this commitment, it's up to you to fulfill the vision. The very fortunate part for Richard and I was that we had seen this vision articulated very, very well. There were three very key designers, Sid Mead, Mobius, and Peter Lloyd. Thank you. And they distilled the vision into this amazing design. And to be able to be part of that and to find that challenge, yet at the same time worry about what exposure should be on what cell, on what of the 76,000 frames is just a huge number to manage, just to keep them in order, to have people who can figure out how to number each one, and you can't overstate how important the details were, but at the same time you got to make the whole film look like it's one person. And so you have 400 people working on the visual effects on this film and on production, and all 400 have to be literally on the same page. You can't say, oh look, I can tell that shot is put together by the person who did the 3 shots before it. No, it has to have a consistency to it and also reflect what the story is.
Let me address some of the computer simulation stuff, because at the time we made Tron, there were no PCs, there were no Macs, there was no internet.
Hang on a second. How many people here were born after 1982?
No cell phones. Right, so there were no cell phones. The computer simulation companies that worked on the film, Magi Synthavision from Ellenshaw, New York, and III were the two main companies, and then Robert Abel and Associates did the real world to electronic world transition. But each one of those companies had their own software and their own hardware. Each computer simulation company was like a hot rod. They had their own engine, they had their own, own way of driving the thing. And so it was our job to make the imagery from one match the other. So we did stylizations of the objects to make them look similar. But one of the most difficult things was that the people who were the technicians in these places were not artists per se. They were technical people who were writing in Fortran, and there wasn't even C at that time. Remember, there was no Maya, no Max, no Lightwave, no Nuke, no After Effects, no Photoshop.
They would take Polaroids of what's on the monitor and mail them to me. And I open the envelope and look at the Polaroid, and then I get them on the phone. Okay, let's talk about it.
So III was here in LA, and Magi was in New York. And what we had to come up with, which Bill Kroyer and Jerry Reese did such a brilliant job of, was to take, first of all, we wanted to do with computer simulations the things that it could do that traditional types of photography couldn't. There are no physical limits to the camera, and there are no physical limits to the objects. So we could do camera moves that nobody had ever seen before. But to come up with those and to come up with a way of diagramming those objects from the storyboards and coming up with a language to communicate to the technical people was something that Jerry and Bill did a phenomenal job of, and I'd like Bill to address that actually.
Well, yeah, there was no animation software, and you couldn't see anything move on a computer screen because there was no what they then called the graphics pipeline that allowed things to actually move. So nothing could move on the computer screen. And essentially what you had to do on Tron was you had to basically render every object every frame. Okay, so I have 24 frames, I'll render it here in frame 1, here in frame 2. So what you're really doing, and it's so basic, is you literally write down the X, Y, Z coordinates and the yaw, pitch, and roll, like the light cycles, right? You just say, okay, on frame 1, it's here on X and Y and Z and yaw, pitch, roll. And you write down literally on the exposure sheet, like an animator exposure sheet, on frame 1, exactly where you wanted it rendered at that point and how you wanted it angled. And then you'd write down where you wanted it rendered and angled on frame 2, and then frame 3. As you can imagine, that's a lot. I can't remember how many, 80,000 frames or some ridiculous amount. And the other problem is, think about it, if you want them to move with curves and everything, think how tough that is to figure out the curves. So Jerry and I were doing this for like the first couple of weeks. And then, there was one computer in the Disney lot. There was one computer. You know where it was? It was on the Oxbury camera. The Oxbury was the big camera, right, that shot down and down shooter. And they had these little dials that you would dial, going to pan left or right, right? You dial. There was a guy named Bill Tondro who invented, he said, I can do this with a computer. So he came up with a computer that they attached to these dials, and it just worked with simple B-splines, right? All you would do is you type a number in, and you would hit a button, and it would do a B-spline calculation, which was just an ease in, ease out curve, right? But I looked at that, and I thought, wait, that's basically what we're doing. So I thought, why don't I just figure out the keyframes of my light cycles? I'll just figure out the keys, and then I'll go down to the Oxbury when the guy's not shooting. I'll sit down there at the computer, and I'll type in my keys, frame 1, frame 17, frame 47, and I'll hit that button, and whoop, up come 47 lines of numbers, right? But there's no way to print them. Yeah. So I literally would sit there and I had to write them all out, which I did. And then if that isn't even worse, then I'd mail them to the computer companies, and then some more schmuck at that end would sit there and he would type them all in, and that's how
then they would call me, just me, and say, we can't do this like this, over the weekend. And then I'd have to,
change. You got another idea?
But, yeah. The thing is, as a director and also as a producer, what you really want to do is you want to find people that are basically, how do I say this, they're better at what they do than if you tried to do what they did. And that was great. It's when I had worked with Bill in Animal Olympics. I'm a great believer in, relationships from film to film, if you can make it happen. And when I saw Bill and Jerry get into the light cycles, we started talking about it, and I went back, and then I thought, man, these guys are really into this, And nothing could have made me feel better than that. And, if you want to know why the light cycles are so incredible in terms of the animation and all of that, it's because of this guy right here. So I'd just like to, put a pin in that concept that the director is going to do every single part of the film and be into it. That's a bad sign. It's like if he can feel confident that someone is better at that than he will ever be and can walk away and get into some other area where they need his help, that's what you want to see happen. And that's the way you want to think about it as a director.
So, Bill, with the animation, when did you sort of, obviously it was a lot of, digital in-betweening, writing down all the numbers. When, in the process of CG, did it sort of click in that it was a little bit more user-friendly and it was a little bit more, you could apply more art to it as opposed to math?
Well, I don't know if it ever really, if that ever quite happened. I mean, if you look at the story, if you ever get a chance to see the storyboards we did, they are dead on to the film, because you couldn't like work your way through these scenes. There was no interactivity. You had to literally define them exactly the way you wanted them, and that was it. Nowadays I have this experience with a lot of my young animators who work in computer graphics. In the old days when we were drawing, it was so hard to draw a scene that you didn't start drawing the scene until you knew what the scene was. You thumbnailed little sketches, and you really worked it out. You really figured out the poses and everything, because it was just so much work to draw 50 drawings.
Yeah, it's too expensive. I went through this with Tron Legacy. You know, animation is additive. You start with nothing, and you have to make everything. And live action tends to be subtractive. You just shoot everything you can, and then you start whittling it down to find out what's best. And you know, these films are so intensive in terms of the work that has to go in every frame that you can't afford to throw anything away. So you better make sure you know down to the frame, literally, what's going to go through the final process before you do it.
And the result really comes out better and different.
Yeah.
And you're forced to make decisions, sensible decisions.
You know, the thing is, when I developed Tron originally down at Lisberger Studios in Venice, we designed all the characters, we storyboarded the whole movie, we wrote the whole script, we did everything, and then it kept improving. It kept going through all these phases, and again, that's what I mean about adding the right people. When Richard got involved, when we really went into production, I knew him during the early phases, and when he got involved, he was the expert on backlight and knew all the scene coordinators coming from Able. And it was really that army that came in and pulled all that together. And Harrison was the man who made, I think, working at Disney Studios possible. I mean, when Bill talks about, you know, how it was 40 years behind the time, it was like one of the Sleeping Beauty. I mean, it was like there were thorny vines growing over all the desks. And, you know, people were looking at us like, who are these computer invaders? We'd have to kill them. And there was quite a bit of animosity.
We were playing rock and roll.
I asked for curtains in my office so I could look at the, you know, transparencies, and they said, "You can't have curtains. You're not a vice president." And but you know, Harrison grew up in that studio, and he made it work for us. It was, you know, and then it became fun. People told me, you know, quietly at night, they said, "I have to tell you a secret. It really feels like it used to feel when Walt was here." Because the mistaken belief was that Walt always knew exactly where they were going. And he said, we were all terrified. Every film was an experiment. We always reached past what we knew. And that's what it feels like now, working on Tron. So,
you know, I just have to say, watching the movie tonight in 70mm, I was struck by the simplicity and the beauty of the film. I mean, I think that there's the fact that it has, by necessity, it was simple because we couldn't do a lot of extra stuff. But I think that forces you into excellent decisions of light, color, composition. And people talk about, yes, we had Sid Mead, yes, we had Mobius, yes, we had Peter Lloyd. But I always say, yes, we had Richard Taylor. I look at Richard Taylor as the essential designer on that film. And when you look at Richard's history and what he's done, and then you look at that film, Tron, boy, I tell you, there's a beauty to that stands up even to this day, and I think it's just absolutely, like, really, there's nothing really happening like that today.
You know, I got to say that those of us who came from the analog era, when you shot on animation stands, when you did opticals to see a composite scene that had to go through an optical printer, go to the lab, come back the next day, then you would look at the wedges on that, you'd have to rewrite and redo the mats, run it through an optical printer. It took days to see changes in the scene. And so everything about working in that era was planning well, storyboarding well, having a clear idea of where you were going to go and working that way. Unfortunately, that's not the way the world works now. If computer simulation was supposed to make things faster, better, and cheaper, why do movies cost $200 million now? And it's because you can change. And they're creating now by change. Rather than clearly thinking out ideas and following the simplest path, it's change after change after change until the very 11th hour.